measured progress since 2001, first as a science content specialist, then as science group manager, and now most recently in a new role as NGSS solution leader. This role is focused on finding solutions with clients and partners to create valid and reliable assessments of the NGSS or other three-dimensional science standards based on a framework for K-12 science education. The role and its focus are really important. It's not just a job, it's a commitment to help states and districts realize transformation in science education and empower their students to be able to make sense of the world around them. The whole science team knew from very early on, from drafts of the framework and the NGSS, that the vision of science education was going to be dramatically different. Neither instruction nor assessment was going to be business as usual. And so from the start, we spent a lot of time studying the framework and the standards, sending feedback on drafts, and discussing the meaning and implication of the standards, as well as thinking about what assessment items might need to look like going forward. We had two early projects that helped set our direction for assessing the NGSS. First, we created a formative assessment offering, STEM Gauge, to help teachers transition to the new standards in elementary and middle school. We also created early assessment prototypes that Roger Bybee included in his book, Translating the NGSS for Classroom Instruction. In creating those early prototypes, we tried to think about how you move beyond old thinking. For example, how do we write items aligned to multiple dimensions? What happens if we leverage item clusters? And is there power in addressing multiple performance expectations in an item set? We know there's no single right way to create a new type of science assessment. There's a whole spectrum of what could potentially work well, based on some common design foundations, but then taken in the context of what a state wants to focus on, what claims they want to make, what constraints they're operating under. When we consider all of those factors together, what can we design that's really going to make it worthwhile for students and give meaningful results about what students are really learning to do in science? The standards are about knowledge in use, not just about memorized disconnected facts and reading numbers off a graph. We know instruction clearly needs to change to reflect this vision of the standards, and ideally assessment needs to feel like an extension of classroom experience. So we ask ourselves, how can we represent that experience to the greatest extent possible in summative assessment? First and foremost, we believe wholeheartedly in the idea of phenomena and storylines. When we are assessing students, we want them to be explaining a phenomenon or solving a real problem. So we create clusters with items that mirror the kinds of thinking and sequence of actions that students are engaging in the classroom, to be able to explain a phenomenon or work to solve an engineering problem. Other groups are creating clusters, but our focus on phenomenon and storyline results in outstanding alignment and content quality. Expanding on that, our approach to developing clusters is somewhat unique. One thing we don't do, some other organizations are creating clusters with items that are very dependent on each other, sometimes even using a method called blocking. In blocking, students finish an item and can't go back because the next item reveals information or answers for the previous item. And while this approach can create a really tight storyline, there's a very real and practical downside. The items are so tightly tied together, it becomes all or nothing in field testing a cluster. It may also require more complicated psychometric models to analyze student performance data. Another way to write a cluster is to simply write a group of items in which each one is aligned to the performance expectations, or PEs, and relates to the context of the cluster. But the items are just a superficial set that don't work together cohesively. We don't write these superficial types of clusters either, because they don't maintain fidelity to the standard's expectation for student performance. So our approach is to write items that have sequence and progression, but are not so tightly tied together that they are actually interdependent. Our approach is to author enough items to create 2 sets for field testing with the same stimulus. We do so by plotting out a storyline that moves from gathering information to reasoning and to making sense of the original phenomenon. Then we write items around each of these stages students would work through to explain the phenomenon or solve the problem. In this way, we can thread different combinations of items from each stage together and maintain a coherent storyline, even if 1 or 2 items don't work in field testing. The result is that we get the most out of our item development effort without sacrificing the integrity of the storyline and the validity of the clusters and assessment. To do this authoring, though, we have to pay attention to many details about the items and the cluster, such as choice of phenomena, stimulus elements including hooks and the amount and types of information, alignment at the item level, and alignment at the cluster level. I'll show you a cluster aligned to Performance Expectation 5-ESS1-2. The text for the PE appears on the screen. Here's the stimulus for the cluster. In crafting a stimulus, we pay close attention to the choice of phenomenon or problem. It has to not only fit the PE or PEs being assessed, but also has to be real, relevant, and grade appropriate. We also believe the stimulus should contain a hook. How or why would students even be thinking about the phenomenon or design problem? In this cluster, we start with the hook that a student sees her shadow changing and wants to know if there's a pattern for the change. This phenomenon is something that many elementary students notice when they're playing outside. The stimulus goes on to provide the information details that will support students in making sense of the shadow changes. You can see there is an investigation setup and resulting data to analyze and interpret. We spend a lot of time making sure the descriptions and supporting information will have the right level of detail to support students in working through the questions about the phenomenon or problem to arrive at an explanation or solution. The first item is a technology-enhanced item, or TEI, focusing on transforming the data from the table to bar graph format. One important thing to note is that we are very purposeful about using TEIs. TEIs can give us the opportunity to leverage some very specific interactions that allow students to demonstrate synthesis of understanding and that can still be machine scored. This is a great example, looking at assessing the specific science and engineering practice skill of representing data in graphical displays in this PE. We can have students use a graphing interaction rather than merely choose from one of 4 presented graphs, which isn't as authentic a measure. The TEI is also more efficient and economical than having students produce a graph by hand. But we don't use TEI simply for the sake of including them and looking flashy. If a multiple choice item suits the construct we are assessing, then that's the item type that we use. We use TEIs only when they provide the best interaction for assessing the targeted construct. I also want to point out that this item is not unidimensional, aligned only to the science and engineering practice of analyzing data. As best practice, every item must be at least 2-dimensional, if not 3-dimensional. So we've brought in the cross-cutting concept dimension of patterns, asking students to include an estimate for the shadow length at the missing time. This item, however, isn't aligned to the disciplinary core idea of phenomena and patterns caused by the motion of celestial objects. While shadow lengths are part of the disciplinary core idea, in this particular item, that idea is only context. students could answer the item without any content knowledge of shadows and their cause. In developing items, we're really careful about this need to distinguish between truly assessing a dimension and merely setting context. Having asked students to represent the data in the first item, the second item asks them to look at the patterns in the data, in part A, and the cause of the patterns, in part B, bringing them further into the PE's expectation that the purpose of making the data display is to be able to reveal and understand patterns related to the disciplinary core idea of the motion of celestial objects. Thus, the item is assessing the cross-cutting concept and disciplinary core idea dimensions of the PE. We chose a multi-part structure for the item in order to assure readability and clarity, and we chose a multi-select format for part A in order to really get students to dig into the patterns for shadow length. The third item also focuses on the cross-cutting concept and disciplinary core idea dimensions. It extends students' demonstration of their understanding of the patterns related to shadow formation. Here, students show they understand that Earth's rotation and the apparent motion of the sun across the sky will create a pattern not only in the length of the shadow, but also in the direction of the shadow. And the final item requires students to synthesize their knowledge and show they have enough understanding to explain not only this specific situation, but also a related situation, shadow lengths in the summer as opposed to winter. This item is three-dimensional, requiring students to use their disciplinary core idea knowledge of celestial motions and effects, their cross-cutting concept knowledge of patterns, and their science and engineering practices skill and knowledge in representing data in displays. In part A, students create a table of the expected measurements for the shadow lengths in the summer. Then in part B, students identify the reasoning for their response to part A. And this really underscores the importance and emphasis on evidence, reasoning, and explanations in the NGSS. When we've finished authoring the items for a cluster, we look at them as a whole. First, we ensure that collectively, the item alignments provide strong assessment of all three dimensions of the PE or PEs. But then beyond that, we also make sure the items work together to really address the core content of the PEs, to cover their depth and breadth, and give us evidence that students know this three-dimensional construct. The cluster as a whole has to be more than the sum of its parts. We've seen sets of items in which each individual item aligns to multiple dimensions and addresses valid aspects of the PEs, but that don't together create a cohesive storyline experience that measures the core intent of the PEs. As you could see in our cluster, we make sure that as students answer the items, they will be able to show that they can represent and make sense of shadow patterns and explain and even extend their thinking around that phenomenon. The dedication and attention we put into authoring item clusters in this way ensures really high quality and well-aligned assessment items. These assessments are supposed to be rigorous measurements of three-dimensional learning, so states and programs need truly multidimensional items and clusters, and need them to be constructed in a way that reflects what students are doing to demonstrate their learning all year long. Tests shouldn't be isolated, disconnected events. They should directly relate to instruction and student experience. I've listened to state counterparts talk about disappointment, that their vendors don't truly understand the standards and what really needs to be invested in assessment development to adequately address them. It takes a tremendous amount of time and collaboration with teachers, item writers, and clients to create good item clusters. These considerations are why we're launching a new model for science content. We're creating a science-secure item bank to help states and districts get access to high-quality content efficiently and economically. As more clients participate, they'll have access to an existing portfolio of content to draw from to build assessments for grades 3 through high school. We see the item bank as a win-win for states and districts, the ability to access both the quality and quantity of content to build a meaningful three-dimensional assessment. The item bank will also offer choice and flexibility for users. Depending on each client's unique goals and the stories they want to tell about their students, they can configure a specific test design to meet their needs. When I was in college, I was planning on a career as a marine biologist. Then I decided to become a teacher instead, to be able to share all the really exciting and interesting things you can learn through science. Fast forwarding to today, with the new science standards and my current role, I feel like I have a valuable way to try to help influence the education system for the better, using my collective knowledge as a scientist, as a teacher, and as an assessment expert. And I'm a parent too. I watch my kids, observe their science experience, and want to help maximize what they can learn and demonstrate in science. Facts are facts, and nowadays we can look up pretty much anything we need to know. So the point isn't being able to recall memorized definitions and content. What's important today is having the skills and abilities to study our world and connect knowledge in order to explain myriad phenomena and solve problems through the power of three-dimensional learning. Those are the enduring things that we need in order to move forward as a society.